Daniel Brooks never imagined that $4.12 would destroy his life, or completely change it forever. On a cold Thursday evening in downtown Chicago, Daniel pushed his yellow janitor cart across the polished marble floor of Greenfield Market. His shift had officially ended 20 minutes earlier, but overtime wasn't paid anymore. Still, he stayed. Someone had spilled coffee near the bakery entrance, and Daniel knew if an elderly customer slipped, nobody would remember who cleaned the floor. They would only remember who didn't. At 29 years old, Daniel had learned something life kept proving over and over again. The people doing the hardest work were usually the easiest to replace. He quietly wrung out his mop, humming the old jazz songs his father loved before the stroke stole most of his speech. His phone vibrated. Dad read. Daniel smiled before answering. "Hey, Dad." Only breathing came from the other end. "Then, bread." His father's voice was weak but hopeful. Daniel glanced toward the bakery shelves. "I know." He checked his wallet. One $5 bill, a few coins, just enough to buy a loaf of fresh bread for dinner and still catch the city bus home. "I'll bring it," Daniel promised. His father tried to laugh. "Don't forget butter." Daniel chuckled. "I'll see what I can do." The call ended. He placed the mop back into the bucket, just one loaf of bread, then home, simple at least. That was the plan. Only a few feet away, the evening rush crowded around the bakery checkout. A gray-haired woman wearing a worn beige coat stood quietly in line. Nothing about her looked unusual. No jewelry, no designer handbag, no expensive watch, just tired eyes and a loaf of whole wheat bread resting on the counter. The cashier scanned it. $4.12. The woman searched inside her purse. Then again, her smile slowly disappeared. "Oh dear." She checked every pocket. "Nothing. I'm terribly sorry." Her voice was soft. "I must have left my wallet at home." The cashier sighed. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I can't complete the purchase." "I understand. If you'd like, we can hold the bread while you go back." Before the woman could answer, the assistant store manager walked over. His name tag read Trevor Mills. He had the kind of smile that disappeared whenever customers had a problem. "What's going on?" The cashier explained. Trevor folded his arms. "So, no payment." The elderly woman nodded apologetically. "I truly forgot my wallet." Trevor forced a laugh. "Funny. We hear that excuse almost every day." Several shoppers turned around. The woman lowered her eyes. "I wasn't making an excuse. I simply forgot." Trevor picked up the loaf. "Then I'm afraid you'll have to step aside. There are paying customers waiting." "I understand." She reached for the bread one last time. "I only wanted to ask if you could hold it until tomorrow." Trevor shook his head. "We don't reserve bakery items. They're sold first come, first served." A teenage customer behind her whispered loudly. "People always expect free stuff." Another customer rolled her eyes. "If you can't afford groceries, maybe don't come shopping." The woman's face turned bright red. She wasn't angry. She was embarrassed. Daniel watched everything from the cleaning aisle. He recognized that look. His father wore the same expression the first time he needed a wheelchair in public. Not pain, humiliation. There's a difference. Daniel slowly walked toward the counter. "Excuse me." Trevor frowned. "This doesn't concern you." Daniel looked at the cashier. "How much?" $4.12. Daniel stared at the $5 bill inside his wallet. That money wasn't extra. It was dinner. It was tomorrow morning's bus fare. It was butter. Just like he promised his father. For one brief moment, he hesitated. Then he remembered something his mother used to say before cancer took her. "If kindness only happens when it's convenient, it isn't kindness." Daniel placed the bill on the counter. "I'll pay." Trevor looked annoyed. "You don't have to." "I know, but I want to." The cashier quietly rang up the purchase. Daniel accepted the change, 28 cents. He handed the warm loaf to the elderly woman. She stared at him in disbelief. "No. I couldn't. You need this." Daniel smiled. "So do you." Tears gathered in her eyes. "You don't even know me." "No, but I know what it feels like when the world makes someone feel small." For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The bakery suddenly felt silent. The woman carefully accepted the bread with both hands, almost as if it were something priceless. "What is your name?" "Daniel. Daniel Brooks." She repeated it softly, as though trying to memorize every syllable. "Daniel. I won't forget you." He smiled. I hope you enjoy the bread. She walked toward the exit, halfway to the door. She turned around. Their eyes met one last time, then she disappeared into the snowy Chicago evening. Daniel picked up his mop, finished cleaning the coffee spill, clocked out, and walked home, completely unaware that the woman carrying the loaf of bread wasn't just another customer. She was Margaret Whitmore, founder of the Whitmore Group, one of the largest privately owned companies in America, and by sunrise, everything Daniel believed about his future was about to change. The next morning, Daniel arrived at Greenfield Market 15 minutes early, just like he had every day for the past 3 years. Outside, the January wind whipped through downtown Chicago, but inside the store everything looked normal. Fresh bread filled the shelves, coffee machines hissed, customers wandered through the aisles. Nothing hinted that Daniel's life was about to fall apart. He tied his Navy maintenance apron, grabbed his mop bucket, and had barely cleaned the front entrance when a voice echoed across the floor. Daniel Brooks. He turned. Trevor Mills stood near the customer service desk with folded arms. Beside him was the store manager, Linda Harris. She rarely came onto the sales floor. Whenever she did, someone usually lost their job. Can you step into my office? Daniel felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Of course. Inside the office, Linda closed the door. She didn't ask him to sit. That alone told him everything. Trevor slid a printed document across the desk. We've received multiple customer complaints about your behavior yesterday. Daniel frowned. My behavior? You disrupted normal store operations. You embarrassed management in front of customers. You ignored company protocol. Daniel stared at him. I bought bread for someone. Trevor nodded. Exactly. Linda finally spoke. Our employee handbook clearly states that staff members are not permitted to interfere in customer payment disputes. Daniel couldn't believe what he was hearing. I wasn't interfering. I was helping. Trevor laughed. You made management look heartless. Daniel's jaw tightened. You were humiliating an elderly woman. Silence filled the room. Linda sighed. Whether you agreed with the decision isn't the issue. The issue is that you ignored authority. She pushed another paper toward him. This is your termination notice. Daniel blinked. Termination. Effective immediately. His heart dropped. I've never been written up. I've never missed a shift. I've worked every holiday. I even stayed late without overtime. Linda looked genuinely uncomfortable. I know. But the decision has already been approved. Daniel thought about his father. The medication, rent, physical therapy, electric bills, everything depended on this paycheck. My dad can't work. He had a stroke. I'm all he has. Trevor shrugged. I'm sorry about your personal situation. But business is business. Daniel looked at Linda one last time. So helping someone is enough to erase 3 years of loyal work. She couldn't meet his eyes. I'm sorry. Daniel slowly removed his employee badge, placed it on the desk, then quietly said, I hope neither of you ever finds out what it feels like to need kindness and not receive it. Without another word, he walked away. 30 minutes later, Daniel stepped onto the freezing Chicago sidewalk carrying a cardboard box. Inside were everything Greenfield Market believed 3 years of service was worth. A coffee mug, a spare work shirt, a framed photo of his father, and 28 cents, the same change left over from buying the bread. He looked at the coins in his hand. Funny. Yesterday those coins had felt meaningless. Today they were almost all he had across the city. Inside a 50-story glass tower overlooking Lake Michigan, Margaret Whitmore stood silently beside her office window. Few people knew this office belonged to the woman who had built the Whitmore Group from a single neighborhood construction company into one of America's most respected business empires. To the public, Margaret had retired years ago, but every major decision still passed across her desk. Her daughter, Claire Whitmore, entered carrying 2 cups of coffee. You've been standing here for 20 minutes. Margaret smiled faintly. I'm thinking about yesterday. The grocery store. Margaret nodded. I've spent my whole life studying business. But yesterday, I learned more about character in 30 seconds than I have in 30 years. Claire handed her a coffee. You've been quiet since you got home. Margaret turned. Claire, do you know what bothered me most? The cashier? The manager? Margaret shook her head. No. The young man. He gave away money he clearly couldn't spare. People with plenty often give, but people with almost nothing rarely can. Claire smiled. You want to find him? I need to. You already asked security. I did. They're reviewing the cameras. Margaret placed the untouched coffee on the desk. And if that young man paid a price for helping me, I intend to make it right. Later that afternoon, Daniel pushed his father's wheelchair toward their small apartment building. Frank Brooks looked at his son's face. You lost job. Daniel forced a smile. I'll find another. Frank slowly shook his head. No. You hide pain. Daniel knelt beside him. I'm okay. His father placed a trembling hand on Daniel's shoulder. When your mother died, she made me promise. Never let kindness make you ashamed. Daniel's eyes filled. I'm not ashamed. I'm just scared. Frank smiled weakly. Good. Means you're still human. Meanwhile, Claire Whitmore's executive assistant entered her office. We found him. Claire looked up immediately. Already. The grocery cameras identified him. Daniel Brooks, former maintenance employee. Claire frowned. Former. He was fired this morning. The room fell silent. Margaret slowly closed her eyes. For helping me. The assistant nodded. According to witnesses, he was terminated because management claimed he violated company policy. Margaret didn't say a word for nearly 10 seconds. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, almost too calm. Prepare the car. Claire recognized that tone immediately. Someone was about to regret a very bad decision. Back at Greenfield Market, Trevor stood proudly in the break room bragging to coworkers. You have to enforce discipline. If employees start playing heroes, they stop respecting management. Several workers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Nobody defended him, but nobody challenged him either. Just then, a black luxury sedan stopped outside the store. Then another. Then another. Customers began looking through the windows. 3 impeccably dressed executives stepped inside. Behind them, walking with quiet confidence, was Margaret Whitmore. Trevor smiled politely. Welcome to Greenfield Market. How may we? Margaret interrupted him. I'm looking for Daniel Brooks. Trevor's smile disappeared. He doesn't work here anymore. Margaret looked directly into his eyes. I know. And that, Mr. Mills, is exactly why I'm here. Trevor Mills suddenly felt every employee in Greenfield Market staring at him. Margaret Whitmore stood just a few feet away, her calm expression somehow more intimidating than anger. The store manager, Linda Harris, rushed from her office after hearing that several luxury vehicles had arrived. She froze. She recognized Margaret immediately. Every business magazine in America had featured her at some point. Although Margaret rarely appeared in public anymore, her face was unforgettable. Mrs. Whitmore. Linda forced a nervous smile. What an honor. Had we known you were coming, Margaret politely interrupted. I didn't come for special treatment. I came for answers. Silence settled across the store. Customers slowed their carts. Employees quietly stopped stocking shelves. Everyone sensed something important was happening. Margaret looked toward Trevor. Yesterday, a young man bought me a loaf of bread. He expected nothing. He didn't ask for my name. He didn't know who I was. Trevor swallowed hard. Margaret continued. Today, I learned you fired him. Linda tried to explain. Our employee policies. Margaret raised one hand. No, don't insult me by hiding behind policies. She slowly walked toward the bakery counter where everything had happened the previous evening. You know what impressed me most? It wasn't the bread. It wasn't even his generosity. It was that he was the only person in this entire building who saw an elderly woman losing her dignity and decided her dignity mattered more than $4. The entire store remained silent. Even customers who knew nothing about the situation felt embarrassed. Margaret turned back toward Linda. I've spent 40 years building businesses, and I've learned one lesson. Companies don't fail because of bad products. They fail because good people stop mattering. Trevor shifted nervously. This is being blown out of proportion. It was just company policy. Margaret looked directly at him. No, it was your character. Across town, Daniel sat beside his father in their tiny apartment. The television played quietly in the background. Neither of them was really watching. Daniel stared at his laptop. 37 job applications, 27 rejections, 10 automated emails, not one interview. His phone buzzed. Unknown number, he almost ignored it. Instead, he answered, Daniel Brooks. Yes, this is Claire Whitmore. Daniel frowned. I'm sorry. I think you have the wrong number. No, I've been trying to reach you. My mother would like to meet you. Daniel searched his memory. I'm not sure I know your mother. There was a brief pause. You bought her bread yesterday. Everything became quiet. The elderly woman? Yes. Daniel smiled slightly. Is she okay? Claire couldn't help smiling herself. She's more than okay, and she'd really like to thank you. Daniel hesitated. That's not necessary. It is to her. An hour later, a black luxury SUV stopped outside Daniel's apartment building. Neighbors peeked through their curtains. Children pointed from the sidewalk. Daniel looked at the vehicle, then at his old sneakers. This has to be a mistake. Frank laughed softly from his wheelchair. I think it's yours. The drive lasted nearly 40 minutes. As downtown Chicago disappeared behind them, the roads grew quieter. Eventually, massive iron gates slowly opened. Beyond them stood one of the most beautiful estates Daniel had ever seen. Elegant gardens, a long stone driveway. Fountains, historic architecture. It looked more like a museum than a home. Daniel whispered, Who exactly is this woman? The driver smiled. I think it's better if Mrs. Whitmore tells you herself. Inside, Margaret was waiting in the library. No security, no assistants, no formal introductions, just tea already prepared on a small wooden table. She smiled the moment Daniel entered. I was hoping you'd come. Daniel smiled awkwardly. I wasn't sure I should. Margaret motioned toward the chair. Please, for a few moments. Neither of them spoke. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. I'm glad you found your way home safely. Margaret smiled warmly. My dear boy. I've had many people ask me if I was safe, but very few have asked whether I got home safely. Daniel shrugged. I figured someone should. Margaret laughed. It was the first genuine laugh she'd had in weeks. After several minutes of conversation, Daniel finally asked the question that had been bothering him. What exactly do you do? Margaret looked at Claire. Claire smiled. I suppose we should tell him. Margaret quietly reached across the table and handed Daniel a framed magazine. The cover read, America's most influential business leaders at the very center. Margaret Whitmore. Daniel looked from the magazine back to the woman sitting across from him. His mouth slowly opened. Margaret nodded. I founded Whitmore Group. Daniel stared in disbelief. The construction company, the hospitals, the housing developments, the renewable energy projects, Margaret smiled. Those are ours. Daniel blinked several times. You mean, Claire finished the sentence. My mother is worth several $billion. Daniel leaned back in complete shock. I bought bread. For a billionaire? Margaret gently shook her head. No, you bought bread for a hungry old woman, and that's exactly why this matters. Claire placed a folder on the table. Daniel looked confused. What's this? Margaret answered, a job offer. Daniel laughed. I'm not qualified to work for Whitmore Group. You haven't even seen my resume. Margaret smiled. I don't need to. Daniel looked puzzled. You don't. She slowly shook her head. I've hired thousands of people. They all had impressive resumes. Some had Ivy League degrees. Some graduated at the top of their class. But very few would spend their last $4 helping someone they believed could never repay them. She leaned forward. I can teach business. I can't teach character. Daniel looked down at the folder. Inside was an offer unlike anything he had imagined. Community leadership associate, full salary, health insurance, training. Education reimbursement, career development. He looked up. There has to be someone better. Margaret smiled. There probably is, on paper, but I don't build companies using paper. I build them using people. Daniel remained silent. His thoughts drifted to his father, the overdue rent, the unpaid medical bills, his mother's dream that one day he'd finish college. Slowly, his eyes filled with tears. I don't know if I belong in your world. Margaret answered without hesitation. Daniel, the moment you chose compassion over convenience, you proved you belonged. The following Monday, Daniel walked into Whitmore Group headquarters. 53 floors of glass and steel towered above him. Executives hurried through marble corridors. Everyone wore expensive suits, designer watches, luxury shoes. Daniel glanced down at his own simple navy blazer. For a moment, he almost turned around. Then he remembered something his father always said. Confidence isn't wearing expensive clothes, it's walking honestly in the clothes you already have. He stepped inside, on the executive floor. Someone was already watching him. Vice President Ethan Cole, 42 years old, Harvard MBA, 8 years climbing the corporate ladder. He watched Daniel through the conference room glass. "Who is he?" An assistant answered. "That's Daniel Brooks, the new leadership associate Mrs. Whitmore personally recruited." Ethan laughed. "The janitor?" The assistant nodded. "I heard that's true." Ethan smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "I've spent 8 years earning every promotion. And now?" A janitor walks in through the front door. He slowly closed Daniel's employee file. "No, this won't last." Across the hallway. Daniel had no idea someone had already decided to destroy his future. Daniel quickly realized that working at Whitmore Group wasn't anything like cleaning floors at Greenfield Market. The marble hallways were different. The expensive suits were different. The meetings were different. But people? People were exactly the same. Some judged others by titles. Some judged them by kindness. Within days, nearly everyone in the headquarters knew the story. "That's the janitor Mrs. Whitmore hired. He doesn't even have a business degree. How long do you think he'll last?" Last. Daniel heard the whispers. He simply kept working. Every morning he arrived before everyone else. Every evening he stayed until the lights dimmed across the executive floor. Instead of pretending to know everything, he asked questions. He listened more than he spoke, and slowly, people who had laughed at him began asking for his help, not because he was the smartest person in the room, but because he was the most dependable. Unfortunately, one person wasn't impressed. Ethan Cole. Every success Daniel earned felt like a personal insult. One afternoon, Ethan stood inside his office overlooking downtown Chicago. His assistant entered. "The board presentation is tomorrow." Ethan nodded. "What about Daniel?" "He's presenting the community housing proposal." Ethan smiled coldly. "Perfect." He opened Daniel's project folder, then quietly removed 3 critical financial reports without those documents. Daniel's presentation would collapse. The board would think he was careless, and Mrs. Whitmore would finally realize she'd made a mistake. The next morning, The executive boardroom buzzed with conversation, 12 board members. Senior executives, department directors, Claire Whitmore, Margaret herself. Daniel sat quietly at the end of the long conference table. He had spent weeks preparing. He believed in the proposal. It wasn't just another construction project. It would renovate abandoned apartment buildings and turn them into affordable homes for veterans, single parents, and elderly residents living on fixed incomes. To Daniel. It wasn't business, it was people. Claire smiled. Daniel, whenever you're ready. Daniel stood, his hands trembled slightly. He connected his laptop. The first few slides went perfectly. The room listened carefully. Even skeptical board members seemed interested. Then, he clicked the next slide. Nothing. His financial reports were gone. Daniel frowned. He searched every folder. Nothing. A quiet murmur spread across the room. Ethan leaned back in his chair. Exactly as planned, Claire whispered, Daniel. He looked around the room. Every eye was on him. He could panic. He could make excuses. Or he could tell the truth. Daniel took a slow breath. I'm sorry. It appears part of my presentation is missing. I don't know how it happened, but instead of pretending I know numbers I can't verify, I'd rather postpone this meeting than mislead the board. Silence, no excuses. No blaming anyone, just honesty. Margaret watched him carefully, then she smiled. Continue. Daniel looked confused, but I don't have the financial data. I know, Margaret replied. I've already read it, so forget the numbers. Tell us why this project matters. Daniel slowly nodded, then something changed. He stopped speaking like an employee. He spoke like someone who had lived the problem. When my father had his stroke, we almost lost our apartment, not because we were irresponsible, but because one medical emergency changed everything. He looked around the room. There are thousands of families just like mine. They don't need pity. They need opportunity. If this company builds homes instead of just buildings, we'll create communities that change lives. By the time he finished, no one was looking at missing spreadsheets anymore. They were looking at him. Several board members quietly applauded. Claire smiled proudly. Margaret didn't say a word, but her eyes said everything. The meeting ended. As executives left the room, Margaret spoke calmly. Ethan, please stay. The room emptied. Only Margaret, Claire, Daniel, and Ethan remained. Margaret placed a small flash drive on the table. Ethan stared at it. Do you recognize this? No. It contains security footage. His expression changed. Claire pressed a button. The conference room screen lit up. There, clear as day, Ethan was seen entering Daniel's office the previous evening. He opened the project folder, removed the financial reports, and quietly walked away. No one spoke. Ethan's face turned pale. It isn't what it looks like. Margaret interrupted. It's exactly what it looks like. Ethan tried again. I worked 20 years to get here, and then you gave opportunities to someone who cleaned floors. Margaret looked at him with disappointment. No, Ethan, I gave an opportunity to someone who understood the people this company exists to serve. She stood. You believed leadership came from impressive credentials. Daniel proved it comes from integrity. Claire slid an envelope across the table. Your resignation has already been prepared. Ethan lowered his head. For the first time in years, he had nothing to say. He quietly picked up the envelope and walked away. Several weeks later, Whitmore Group officially approved Daniel's housing initiative. Construction began across Chicago. Hundreds of affordable apartments were renovated. Veterans moved in. Senior citizens found safe homes. Families who had been sleeping in shelters finally received keys to their own front doors. The project became national news, not because of profits, but because of people. One Sunday afternoon, Margaret asked Daniel to accompany her on a short drive. The black sedan eventually stopped somewhere familiar. Greenfield Market. Daniel smiled. I haven't been here since. I know. Margaret smiled back. Come with me. Inside. The bakery looked exactly the same. The smell of fresh bread filled the air. Only one thing had changed. Trevor Mills was gone. Linda Harris no longer managed the store. A young cashier greeted them warmly. Daniel laughed softly. Looks different. Margaret picked up a loaf of whole wheat bread. Exactly the same kind Daniel had bought weeks earlier. She placed it on the counter. $4.12, the cashier said. Margaret looked at Daniel. Would you do the honors? Daniel smiled. He reached into his wallet, paid for the bread, collected 28 cents in change, the exact amount he had received that unforgettable evening. Margaret held out the loaf. It's yours. Daniel looked surprised. I thought you were buying it. I am, but today, I'm giving it back. He accepted the bread, confused. Margaret smiled gently. You thought you bought me $4 worth of bread. She paused. What you really gave me was faith. Faith that kindness still exists. Faith that this company could become something better. And faith that the future belongs to people who choose compassion when no one is watching. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. I only did what anyone should do. Margaret shook her head. No, you did what very few people actually would. A year later, Daniel stood on the stage at Whitmore Group's annual leadership conference. Thousands of employees filled the auditorium. Behind him, a simple photograph appeared on the giant screen. It wasn't a billion-dollar office. It wasn't a luxury mansion. It wasn't an award. It was a loaf of bread. Daniel smiled. You know, people often ask me the day my life